grimace and answered, "Just fine." He met Ratwell's gaze and, as if unconsciously, stretched his neck and passed a hand over his throat. He'd purposely worn a polo shirt with his jacket, open at the collar. The vivid purple had gone out of his throat now, but the marks were clearly there. Ratwell didn't blink. Either he didn't know about Leo's little communication 2 nights ago, or he was able to stay extremely composed about it. The third lawyer, whose name didn't stick with Drake, had crossed to the back of the conference table and staked out the same chair he'd had at the previous session. As the others took their seats, Drake sent a tight smile toward the mechanic, sending the message, "Enjoy this, buddy. You're next." The session started much as the previous one, with questions from Ratwell about Drake's qualifications. He answered by rote, telling the truth but not letting the substance of the question or the manner of the questioner affect him. After an hour or so of covering the same ground, the lawyers changed tactics. Ratwell appeared to be getting impatient. While he took a break for a glass of water, the guy in the gray suit started in with specific questions about the crash. By the lunch break, Drake was feeling a bit more relaxed. The thing pilots did and the ways they would react to emergency situations were familiar to him. The lawyers had come up with nothing he couldn't answer with confidence. At lunch with Valdez, over another burger at Lucky's, he found himself actually smiling. "Don't get too calm just yet," the lawyer cautioned, swallowing a bite of his green chili cheeseburger. "Remember, these guys want to pin the accident on the engine manufacturer. Learning that the pilot wasn't at fault will go right to their goals." "Okay, they're establishing that the pilot did all the right things. We're in agreement on that." "Which is good. Finding some common ground with the other side isn't necessarily a bad thing." Drake dipped a potato wedge in ketchup. "So, are they going to ask me about the mechanic's role this afternoon?" "My guess, probably so. But who knows with these guys." In the afternoon session, Ratwell was absent. Brown took over and began with general maintenance questions, procedures that Drake knew well. He answered confidently when asked about the frequency of inspections and which procedures could be done by an airframe and power plant mechanic, and which would have to be signed off by someone holding an aircraft inspector license. He readily admitted that he had some experience with the work but was not licensed at either level. Brown clearly wanted Drake to be apologetic or become rattled, but Drake held his own. "Now, Mr. Langston, in this particular accident case, you've stated that the mechanic forgot to sufficiently tighten one of the nuts and did not safety wire it." "I can't say whether he tightened it or not. I can say that in the wreckage of the engine, the nut had come off and there was no evidence that it had been safety wired, although the other nuts on that part of the engine were wired." "So, one small piece of wire brought down the whole aircraft. I find that very unlikely." Drake opened his mouth, but Brown continued. "Isn't it far more likely that there was a defect in the engine's design or manufacture that caused the failure leading to the crash?" "This particular engine has been in use for more than 20 years, with few problems. I think that would rule out design flaws." "Few problems?" Brown looked like an angler who just snagged the big one. "Then there have been engine failures." Drake took a deep breath. "There have been engine failures, but—" "Note the witness's admission that there have been engine failures." Brown turned toward the stenographer. "This isn't the courtroom," Rick Valdez reminded. Drake continued where he'd been interrupted. "But in each of the documented cases, 3 in all, the failure was traced to either pilot error, an inspection not done correctly, or other human error. I have documentation." He reached for his folder. "Note this evidence for the record as well," Valdez said, giving Brown the same intense stare the lawyer had so recently aimed at the stenographer. Drake pulled out the accident reports from the other 3 incidents, thankful that he'd anticipated this line of questioning. Brown quickly glanced at them and asked that copies be made for his files. The lawyer continued questioning, throwing in a number of queries that didn't appear to Drake to have much at all to do with the case. When Drake asked Valdez about it during the mid-afternoon coffee break, the chubby attorney shrugged. Some guys like to think they're clouding the record with stuff like that. It might work in front of a jury, throwing out a lot of irrelevant stuff to confuse them, but in this kind of proceeding, it just wastes time. My guess is that he doesn't have much else. He was counting on being able to get you to admit that the engine design could have been at fault. They were in Valdez's office with the door closed, having coffee and cookies that his secretary had left on the cherry credenza. Why? Why does everyone seem to think that corporations want to deliberately make their products fail? There's no logic in that. Logic? No. Money? Yes. Valdez topped his mug. Get a case like this in front of a jury, and 9 times out of 10, they want to sock it to the corporation with a big money award. Ratwell and Brown know that. They want enough evidence for the judge to let them take it to trial. No wonder every part on the damn aircraft costs so much. Hey, the corporations know it too. It's easier for them to agree to pay $10 million in a settlement than to risk having a jury hit them for $100 million. And the cost of appealing a judgment like that, it gets unbelievably expensive. They'll pay out of pocket. Well, their insurance will. And everyone's insurance rates skyrocket because of it. Drake found himself pacing the carpet, remembering how his own insurance company had notified him last month that his rates would go up 20% come January 1st, despite the fact that he'd never filed a claim in his entire career. It's not right. Not when the fault lies with some mechanic's mistake. A mistake he might have made simply because the phone rang at the wrong moment, or the boss pushed him to finish early so they could get the aircraft back in service by the next morning. Valdez shrugged. I know. There are no easy answers. People died, and their families want somebody to pay. The word accident has slipped from our vocabulary in recent times. Everything has to be someone's fault, and the more money it appears you have, the more likely it is the fault is going to be yours. Valdez set his cup back on the silver tray and took Drake's. I don't know what to tell you, other than we've got to go back in there, and you need to unwind a little. Drake sighed. I know I'm going to want to spout off to the creep, the same things I just said to you. Well, don't. If you think it's going to be a problem, I'll ask that we continue this another day. Antagonizing these guys isn't going to change their ways, and they'll either go after you with a vengeance, more determined than ever to win this case, or they'll just blow you off and go find another witness who'll say what they want. Drake felt the tension go out of his jaw. You're right. Pissing them off isn't going to help. So, should we go back in there? Or shall I ask for a recess? Oh, I'll go back in there. Let me visit the men's room first. Drake knew his own nature. He'd simply go home and stew about it all night, build an even greater anger, and then come back the next day with a worse attitude. As he splashed water on his face and dried his hands, he forced himself to calm down. Make your points, hold your ground, he told himself. Don't let the bastards get you down, as Charlie would advise. Brown seemed subdued in the late afternoon session. He'd probably spent the coffee break with cell phone to his ear, down in the lobby of the building, out of earshot, demanding that somebody come up with some evidence to contradict Drake's testimony. But Drake knew there wasn't any. He'd spent months digging through records, looking for anything that might weaken Valdez's case, and he hadn't found it. FAA and NTSB records on accidents were thorough. There hadn't been a case since the introduction of the S-Jet 1200 engine that would say differently. That knowledge kept his temper in check, and he found himself almost able to see the humor in the opposition's desperate moves earlier. The gray-suited attorney resumed the questioning, but his queries were routine, recovering ground that they'd already been over. As 5 o'clock approached, it became apparent that the other team had no new information, and Drake began to relax. As the others put on their jackets and gathered their files, they thanked him for his time. "No problem, gentlemen. It's really all about doing the right thing, isn't it?" The lawyer gave him a funny look. Malcolm Brown almost hung his head, but caught himself in time. No one from that side was going to admit that they weren't on the side of truth and justice. Maybe just the American way. "Let's go get a drink," Valdez suggested. "You've had a rough few days." They stepped off the elevator and Rick's phone rang. "Yeah," Valdez said. A moment later, "What?" Drake watched as the attorney's face registered shock. He stood still as Rick nodded a few times and then ended the call. The stocky attorney turned to him. "Manuel Salazar is dead." Chapter 26. I rolled over and realized with a start that it was after 10 o'clock. I'd slept like the dead after Drake got up and left early. With a groan, I pulled the covers up and rolled over again. The week of early mornings, combined with the assaults on my body, clearly left me needing extra rest. Finally, I dragged myself out of my comfy nest and into the shower, where I indulged in a full round of pampering that included both skin and hair conditioners. As I'd told Drake, I needed to go back to Santa Fe today. If nothing else, I'd left most of my things there. It didn't seem right to ask Linda to clear out the room and deliver my stuff home to me. Plus, there were still too many unanswered questions. It's bullheaded, I know, but I wasn't going to just let it go that I'd now been attacked twice. Someone thought I knew something incriminating. Somewhere amid the questions I'd asked or the files I'd copied from Light's computer, there was information that might help catch a killer. I walked into the kitchen to look for something to eat. There on the kitchen table lay a gun. It was my Beretta 9mm, freshly cleaned and loaded, along with a note from Drake. "Don't let anything happen to you," it said. He was right, of course. Foolish of me to go back near the scene of the crimes without protection. I carried it to the living room and stuck it into my purse. Back in the kitchen, I stood at the open refrigerator door, debating among the various choices. Breakfast or lunch? The cool air was rushing out, and Rusty now joined me to see what he might snag, as long as I was taking my time about it. I finally just picked up a package of deli turkey and made myself a sandwich, tossing small bits to the dog, noticing for the first time that he wasn't quite as spry in catching them. How old was he now? I really couldn't remember. A tap at the back door interrupted, saving me from having to think too hard. My neighbor Elsa stood there, visible through the panes of glass. "I know you're busy," she said. I felt a guilty stab that I hadn't been over to check on her once this week. "I brought you some tomatoes from the garden." She held out a bag, and I savored the fresh outdoorsy smell of them. "And I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be away for a few days." Now that really was news. Since her sister in Denver passed away over 10 years ago, I couldn't remember a single time Elsa had been away from home overnight. "A lady from my church talked me into taking a trip with her. It's a bus trip to Vegas. We're going to clean out the slots." "Really? But there are casinos all over New Mexico. Why Vegas?" I had to admit that I've not seen that much sparkle in her eyes in a long time. "Because we can, sweetie." She patted my hand. "At our age, there's no sense putting off anything." "Well, I agree. You go and have a great time." I watched her walk back through the break in the hedge to her own back door. I could feel a smile coming on. Why not? I silently wished her luck. A glance at the kitchen clock told me I better get myself in gear. I tried to explain to Rusty that he couldn't come along and that we would all be back in time for dinner. All he really got from the whole conversation was that he would get a rawhide chew in return for staying home. All the way back to Santa Fe, I contemplated the unsavory doings at the conference. For a bunch of people who were into peace and love and all that, there sure were a lot of unloving things going on, like having my neck almost broken and then being knocked in the head. David Ratwell and Trudy were still my main suspects, although the more I thought about it, Stanworthy/Light was right up there too. I negotiated the winding road to Casa de Tranquilidad and spotted Linda near the lobby entrance. I tooted my horn at her and went on to the parking lot. She was still standing by the door when I caught up with her. "Have you seen Trudy today?" Stanworthy had too high a stake in this place and in his business to take a chance on being caught assaulting one of the attendees, even if he did have a lot to hide. Trudy, on the other hand, anything could be possible with her, and she'd been here every day of the conference. "How's your head?" she asked, ignoring my question as we walked to our room. "Amazingly well." I remembered the nearly euphoric feeling when Samantha Sweet had helped me up. The lady had some kind of healing touch, for sure. Nonetheless, Linda made me sit on the edge of the bed and submit to another head feeling up before she pronounced me fit for light duty. "I need to track down Trudy. If she's the one who hit me, I want her to know it didn't work." "Charlie, don't get yourself into—" "I just have a few questions for her." Like, why hadn't she acknowledged that she knew Rita from California? And where had she been yesterday when I got whacked in the parking lot? "I'll be either here or in the library if you need me," Linda said. I walked next door to Trudy's room and knocked. 30 seconds later, I knocked again. I pressed my ear to the door but couldn't hear a thing. Maybe Shirley would know her schedule. As I recalled, most of the classes had wrapped up this morning, but there were probably spa appointments and such this afternoon. I cut through the hotel lobby and entered the reception area for the conference section of the building. No one attended the desk at the moment, so I headed down the hall. Shirley's office was on the left, next to Light's. Her lights were on, and I tapped at the partially open door. "Hi, Charlie. Just getting a few things organized for tonight's farewell gathering. You'll be there, right?" "I'll try." I tried to look regretful, but couldn't imagine listening to Calais Light speak for hours. I noticed a canvas bag on the floor in the corner. "That's Rita's," Shirley said, following my gaze. "The police couldn't decide who to give it to, so it ended up here." She looked back up at me. "What can I do for you?" "I'm trying to find Trudy, and she's not in her room. Do you know if she had a spa treatment this afternoon?" She sat down and hit a few keys on her computer. "Let's take a look at the schedule." I took the chair opposite her desk and willed the computer to work a little faster. "No, I don't see anything here. In fact, I seem to remember her mentioning that she planned to take a nap, organize her papers, something like that. She's not leaving until tomorrow. I think we asked the hotel to arrange a shuttle pickup to the airport around noon." She looked away from the screen and turned her attention to me. "She's probably asleep in her room, just didn't hear you knock. You look like you could use a nap too, Charlie. Take advantage of a couple of free hours." "Yes, maybe I will." I stood up. "Is Dr. Light in his office?" "I doubt it. He usually goes to the spa for a long massage before our final evening. Relaxes him." I thanked her and left. Instead of exiting through the courtyard, I veered out to the main lobby. 2 young clerks who'd been lounging against the front desk snapped to attention and became busy as I approached. "Excuse me, my roommate went off this afternoon and must have taken my key with her. Can I get another one? Room 14? The brunette picked up a blank card, hit a couple of keys, and swiped it through a slot on her computer keyboard. "Here you go." That was way too easy. Her supervisor would have at least required a name and ID. I headed down the hall and used the key on Trudy's door. It opened easily, with nary a safety latch to stand in my way. As I'd suspected, she wasn't there. I poked my head into the bathroom and even whisked back the shower curtain to be sure. I made sure the door was closed tightly and decided to do a quick snoop through. As I'd noticed from my previous peek into the place, Trudy wasn't exactly a neat-nick. Clothes were strewn over the bed and chair. Her open suitcase lay on the floor in one corner, hair care gear and cosmetics lying haphazardly inside, as if she'd tossed them there each time after using them. Her conference tote bag and pages of handouts lay on the desk, again scattered about as if she tossed each day's new batch on top of the old. I riffled through them, seeing notes in scrawling, lopsided script. Many of them were barely readable, but those I could easily decipher seemed to pertain only to the class discussion. My eyes landed on another note, this one on a small sheet of hotel notepad paper, stuck under the edge of the desk lamp. Trudy hadn't written this one. The handwriting was too different. Bold, slanting letters, decidedly masculine. Meet me in the parking lot, 4 o'clock. I glanced at my watch. It was after 5. I didn't like the feel of this. I took the note with me and rushed back to Linda's in my room. I startled her at the desk. Trudy's missing. We've got to go look for her. Linda stared at me as if I'd gone mad, but quickly recovered. My friends soon become accustomed to my dashes into the unknown. She pulled on a pair of sneakers while I recapped what I'd found. She was to meet someone in the parking lot, I said as we locked our room and headed across the courtyard. I don't know whether Trudy is a victim or an accomplice, but somehow this feels like it's tied to the attacks on me. The parking area appeared unchanged since I'd arrived. There may have been a few different cars. I hadn't taken close notice of them the first time. We walked to the perimeter of the lot, watching for anything out of place. I debated whether it would be worthy to note license plates and check them, but that would take a lot of time, and something about this felt urgent. I just couldn't put my finger on it. After 15 minutes with no results, Linda began to get impatient. Other than the note, is there any reason to think she actually came here? We stopped beside the last car on the last row. No, I guess not. Does she have a car here? Maybe we should find out which one is hers and concentrate on that. I thought about it. No, Shirley said she was taking a shuttle to the airport. Then the other person's car. Have you figured out who she was meeting? I thought about that. Calais Light's car, the pearl-white Lexus, sat parked in its usual spot, and I'd surreptitiously laid a hand on the hood when we walked by it. It had not left recently. Charlie, she could be anywhere, couldn't she? Technically, yes, but I have a feeling about this. She's somewhere here on the grounds. Then let's be logical about it. Maybe she's having a massage. I didn't tell her that I'd already asked Shirley about that. After all, it was possible that Trudy had walked in and they accommodated her. Okay, I'll try that. You don't have to come if you don't want to. She glanced at her watch. I'll give it another 15 minutes. I have some patient calls to return, and I really need to have a shower and wash my hair before the evening meditation starts. We walked toward the lobby and circled through it, paying attention to its various alcoves and overstuffed leather couches and chairs. No sign of her. The doors to the dining room were closed, and a peek through the glass panes showed it to be empty of customers. On to the spa, where a lone attendant stood behind the reception desk, flipping through the day's receipts, tallying something on a calculator. Sorry, all the appointments are finished. The last client left about 10 minutes ago. Was Trudy Blanchard one of them? She looked a little put out, but pulled out her gilt-edged appointment book and opened it to the right page. No, nothing for her, either scheduled or walk-in. I write those down, too. Could she be in the locker room? We'll be quick if you let us look. She barely concealed the expression that said, It's Friday night and I have a date, and waved us through. Linda and I took opposite sides of the corridor. She walked into the glassed-in hot tub room, scanning the water surface and pushing aside the fronds of potted plants, while I took the locker rooms. At the men's door, I tapped and called out loudly. The place echoed back hollowly. In the ladies' locker room, an attendant stood by her station, folding towels. Is anyone still in here? No, senora. All gone. For extra measure, I called out Trudy's name, but this room, too, echoed back at me. Back in the corridor, Linda reported that the mud bath and hot tub areas were empty. I'd better head back to the room and get ready. Okay, I'll be along in a minute. I'm going to take the back way and walk around the building once. Be careful. Walking around by yourself got you into trouble before. She turned back the way we'd come. I remembered seeing an emergency exit at the far end of the corridor, beyond the ladies' locker room, so I went that way. What was I going to do if I found Trudy anyway? If she'd been the one who attacked me earlier, she'd no doubt try it again. Foolishly, I'd left my purse with the Beretta in it in our room. I'm in pretty good shape, but against someone with the strength of insanity on her side? I looked around for a weapon, but found only a stack of clean towels. I grabbed one, nearly laughing at the absurdity of it. What was I going to do? Snap her with it or blindfold her? Nevertheless, I took opposite corners of the towel and spun the piece of cloth into a strong whip. The attendant from the locker room came out, her Casa de Tranquilidad smock gone now, her purse over her arm. She gave me a curious stare but didn't say anything as she walked out. The place suddenly felt very quiet, and I felt very alone. Just get this over with, Charlie. I headed toward the end of the hall where I'd seen the other exit. Then the lights went out. The hairs on my neck bristled. I stopped, blind. Chapter 27. Minutes ticked by in what must have actually been about 10 seconds. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again. No emergency lighting, but faintly ahead, I could see the glowing green letters of a lighted exit sign. I faced it squarely and edged forward. I could only hope that no one had remembered to lock the door, or I'd have to traverse the whole corridor again to find my way back. I visualized the hall. Aside from the recessed countertop where I'd found my towel weapon, it was long and straight without obstacles. Light switches. I couldn't remember. But that's hardly the thing one notices right away. They had to exist. Dropping one end of the towel, I edged to my right and felt for the wall. It wasn't that far, probably 20 feet, and the tiny green letters actually sent a small glow to guide me. I could do this. I hummed a little non-tune to keep myself company, but quit when it echoed eerily off the tile walls. Brushing my fingertips lightly along the wall, I moved forward, covering a foot at a time. I encountered a door frame, something I didn't remember, and my fingers followed the recess across the door itself. I just touched the outcrop of the molding on the other side when a loud thump rattled the door. I jumped back from it, a scream forming in my throat and coming out as a squeak. Every logical thought told me to run, but I envisioned myself bouncing off the walls like a metal ball in a pinball machine, unable to get to my destination. I skittered frantically away from the door. Another loud bump, then 2, 3, 4. "Who's in there?" I shouted, my voice careened off the tile. I edged away and felt the opposite wall against my back. The echo of my words died away, leaving my raspy breath as the only sound. I forced myself to calm down, to breathe through my nose. As my own noises died away, I caught a faint voice. "Help me!" it called. Oh, God, what was going on here? 2 more bumps, and again, "Help!" Not in the dark, I swore. If this is a trap, I want to at least see it before I walk into it. I extended both hands, feeling the wall behind me, edging always closer to the exit sign. At last, I encountered a double switch. I rammed both switches upward and blinded myself. My eyes slammed shut against the cruel glare of the fluorescent light on white tile. I cupped both hands over my face for additional protection. Gradually, through slotted fingers, I eased my eyes open and scanned the corridor. Empty as before. Across from me, the door I'd touched was labeled with a small sign that said "Employees Only." Another bump came from it, this one seemingly fainter than before. Again the voice, muffled. "Help me!" It sounded feeble and not nearly so frightening anymore. I lowered my hands and walked toward it. My towel weapon lay nearby. I must have flung it away in my panic. I tiptoed to the door and listened. "Who's in there?" By keeping my voice low, the horrible echo was minimal. The answer came as a scraping noise on the floor. I tried the doorknob. Locked. Now what? "Wait," I said as if the person had any choice. "I'll be right back." I rushed back to the reception area, flipping on more lights along the way. The desk consisted of a long granite top with 2 shallow drawers under it and banks of deeper drawers and columns on either side of the swivel chair. I yanked open the 2 shallow drawers first and was rewarded with the sight of a small compartmented tray that contained a ring of keys and a few loose ones. I grabbed all of them. As an extra measure, I also took a box cutter with a lethal-looking razor blade concealed in a heavy metal handle. Feeling considerably braver now, I approached the unknown door again. "I'm back. I'm going to see if any of these keys work, so just be patient." The answer came as a small scraping sound. I glanced through the loose keys first, discarding them when they all appeared to be the small type used for filing cabinets. The key ring gave more choices, with several that could work on doors. I tried 2 before I came to the one that worked. I operated it with my left hand, pulling the box cutter out of my pocket with the right. A prone figure lay face down on the floor of the small supply closet, wrists and ankles bound with rope, hair matted over the face, clothing covered with dust. I retracted the blade on my weapon and stuck it back into my pocket. "It's okay now. I'll get you out of here." I knelt beside the dirt-covered form and rolled it over toward me. It was Trudy. Chapter 28. Her eyes squinted tightly against the light, and she groaned when I touched her. "What happened, Trudy? Who put you here?" Her mouth worked for a moment, then went slack. I felt her neck and found a fluttery pulse at her carotid artery. I tried to roll her onto her back, but the closet was too tight. I'd have to get her out of here. I backed out of the tiny room and grabbed the rope at her ankles. She probably outweighed me by 20 pounds, and the dead weight didn't make the job any easier. Inch by inch, with a grip on her ankles, I dragged her out of the confinement of the closet. She wore an old ratty running suit and sneakers, so once I got the bulk of her body past the concrete floor in the closet and onto the smooth tile in the corridor, she slid along much more easily. I rolled my former towel weapon to form a pillow and cushioned her head with it. Then I took the box cutter and cut away the ropes from her wrists and ankles. Her breathing seemed shallow but steady. I grabbed another towel from the alcove and dampened it with cold water from the locker room. As I dabbed the cold towel on her forehead and temples, she stirred slightly and began to murmur. She didn't look like quite such a formidable enemy now. "Trudy, it's Charlie. You're okay." Mumbled words that didn't make any sense. "Trudy, stay right here. I'm going to get help." The nearest phone was at the reception desk. I'd left my cell in the room. I left Trudy on the floor with the cold towel on her forehead and rushed to the desk. What to do? I remembered the smelling salts Linda had used to bring me around. I tried calling her first. With any luck, maybe she hadn't already left for the meditation session. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, where are you?" "I never made it out of the spa. I found Trudy. She needs medical attention. Can you come, or should I call an ambulance?" I gave her a quick description of Trudy's condition. "I'll come. Give me 3 minutes. I just stepped out of the shower." "You're a doll. I'll wait here in the corridor outside the locker rooms." I locked the main door and returned to the hallway. Trudy was lying where I'd left her, thrashing restlessly as if in a bad dream. I knelt beside her. Trudy, calm down. Help is coming." I stroked her arm and repositioned the wet towel which had slipped. She murmured something I couldn't understand. "What, Trudy? What happened?" More restless movement. "Who did this?" I slapped lightly at the back of her hand. "Who were you meeting in the parking lot? Who left you that note?" At the mention of the note in the parking lot, she mumbled louder. It was like she was still far away, but had somehow come a little closer to me. I pressed the advantage. "Trudy, come on. Tell me who you went to see." A mumbled word came out. "Say it again, Trudy. I didn't hear you." David." More mumbled words came, something I took to mean, "I went to meet David." Puzzling. I thought he was at Drake's deposition. I repeated his name, and she nodded ever so slightly. "Don't worry about it. We've got help coming." I could hear the sounds in the reception area now. Back here, Linda! A commotion sounded behind me, and I looked over my shoulder to see Linda, wearing hastily donned sweats and a t-shirt and carrying her medical bag. Shirley bustled along behind her, dressed for the evening social gathering in a gauzy purple skirt and beaded purple top. She'd fluffed her curly brown hair and even added a touch of lipstick. Without a word, Linda knelt beside Trudy. She felt for a pulse and ran her hands along the sides of Trudy's face and neck, much as she'd done for me. Trudy's eyes began to flutter open. I stood up and backed out of the way. "Can you hear me? Do you feel pain anywhere?" Linda's expert hands continued to examine, checking her patient's arms and legs as she spoke. "No, water," Trudy croaked. "In a minute." Linda turned to me. "I don't think anything's broken." "I'll get it," Shirley offered. She headed toward the reception area and returned a minute later with a small paper cup. By this time, Trudy had managed to sit up, and she took the water gratefully. Her hands and face looked grimy with dirt from the closet floor, and her hair stuck out in wild gray tangles. She appeared shaken and groggy. Drugged? Shirley found a wicker chair with a soft flowered cushion in the hot tub area and brought it into the hall. Linda and I took Trudy by the upper arms and helped her rise and get to it. She flopped onto the seat. I motioned Linda aside. "What now? Should we get an ambulance?" "All they would do is take her to the hospital where she'd be admitted overnight for observation. I can do the same thing here if she'll let me. Let's give her a few minutes to compose herself, and I'll ask her." I sneaked a look at my watch. 6:15. No wonder Shirley seemed restless. Dr. Light would be well into his meditation session by now, and here were 3 of their attendees sidetracked. They'd made such a big deal of the special evening. I knew the size of the crowd would be important to them. Linda knelt beside Trudy, talking quietly to her. The patient looked better. A bit of color had come into her face now, although she still wasn't talking much. In Trudy's case, that could be somewhat worrisome. "Shirley, could you arrange for some soup to be sent to Trudy's room in about 30 minutes? Linda looked to her patient for confirmation and got a small nod. "I'm going to sit with her for a while and get her settled in for the night." "I'm due back in Albuquerque tonight," I said, knowing this delay would set me back. "I'll help you get everything arranged before I head out." Shirley didn't look terribly happy about the loss of 3 participants, but she didn't have much choice in the matter. She bustled away to handle her part of it. "Come on, Trudy. We're going to get you to your room." She stood shakily, and we slowly headed out. A few minutes later, with Linda and Trudy settled into the room next door, I tossed my clothes into my duffel. The experiences of this week had been interesting, to say the least, but I wouldn't be sad to see the last of Santa Fe for a while. I planned to take a quick shower to wash off the closet grime, then pop in and say goodbye to Linda and to encourage Trudy to file charges against David for assault. For my own part, I would phone the Santa Fe police on Monday and give them what I knew about David Ratwell and Robert Stanworthy. They could do with it as they wished. Right on cue, I heard a sharp knock on the door to Trudy's room. "Room service," the voice called. I stripped down and stepped into the shower. My spirits lifted as I soaped off the dust from the supply closet and fantasized about being at home again. By the time I dried my hair, put on fresh jeans and a sweater, and packed the last of my toiletries, I figured Linda and Trudy would be finished with their light supper. I phoned Drake and got a voicemail. I left a message that I'd be on the road within 15 minutes. Leaving my bags in the room, I walked next door and rapped lightly at room 14. Come on, I thought, tapping my foot. I knocked again, louder. "Linda, it's me!" A frisson of unease shivered down my spine. "Linda? Trudy? Open up!" Nothing. I looked up and down the hall. Nothing seemed out of place. Where had they gone? Linda would not take off without telling me. At the very least, she would have left a message on our phone. I let myself back into room 12 and found the card key I'd gotten earlier for the other one. Something told me to take along my gun, and I tucked it into the waistband of my jeans. Every nerve ending went taut as I struck the key into Trudy's lock. My eyes scanned the room, and I knew my fears were justified. Linda's medical bag had fallen off the desk, stethoscope and vials spilled all over the carpet. The room service tray lay on its side against the table's legs. Thick bean soup ran down one wall, the bowl smashed in shreds on the floor below. The lick of fear at my spine congealed into a hard place low in my gut. I grabbed the phone, punched 911. 2 women have been abducted. Get the police here now. I held on just long enough to confirm that they had the address before I slammed the instrument down and dashed out of the room. Which way did they go? I debated for a second and decided to try the rear exit, the one to the courtyard. I'd just reached the end of the hall when I heard a noise behind me. Chapter 29. I whirled, reaching for my gun. Gerald Mayhew's eyes grew large as he spotted me. I quickly concealed the weapon. "Gerald, quick, come with me. I can use some help." He glanced back once and walked toward me slowly. "Linda and Trudy are gone," I said, my breath coming out in quick bursts. He raised his shoulders in a small shrug. "It's David Ratwill. He's got them." Puzzlement and anger crossed his face at the same time, but he jogged the remaining length of the hall. "It happened within the last 10 minutes, I said, shoving open the door to the courtyard. "I'm hoping they haven't gone far." Soft landscaping lights highlighted the rocks and trees within the short adobe wall. Beyond that, dusk faded to black. Suspecting that they'd head for a vehicle, I told Gerald I'd take the parking lot and sent him to check the lobby. "Don't get physical with him. I don't know what he'll do. If you can, just keep him there until the police arrive." I trotted toward the parking area, leaving Gerald looking like he wasn't quite sure what he'd gotten into. As I passed the low adobe wall, I couldn't help but look over it, at the place where Rita had gone down. It had to be David. I'd known from the beginning that there was something off when he'd showed up here. Poor Rita had known he was a threat to her, yet she'd been unable to do anything about it. Now he had Linda and Trudy, and there was no telling what desperate measures he might take. I scanned the dark slope, looking for any sign of movement. In the deepening gloom, I could make out only the dark blobs of trees and occasional tufts of yellow blooming shamisa. On toward the parking area, I kept up a quick jog, trying to look every direction, watching for motion in the shadows and possible hiding places. The path narrowed, lit only by small sidewalk lights every 20 feet or so. The overhead lighting in the parking lot was adequate for a person to locate a car, but hardly enough for me to tell whether someone was hiding out there. I skirted the edge of another trap, watching for movement. At the far end of the second row, I spotted a woman getting into a car. "Joanne!" I ran up to her. "Can you help me?" I quickly gave her the same version I'd given Gerald. "We've got lots of ground to cover. Can you help me check out this side and the front of the building?" Bless her, she didn't question me. She tossed her purse into her car, locked it, pocketed the keys, and followed my lead. We edged the rest of the parking area, then headed down the long driveway that led from Casa de Tranquilidad to the main road. Small landscape lights shone up into some of the trees. Otherwise, it had become pitch dark out here. I wished that I'd thought to find a flashlight to bring. Joanne and I took opposite sides of the wide drive, alert for any sign of movement out in the blackness. How far could they have gone? I knew a moment later. Ahead, in a wide spot in the road, a tiny light caught my attention. "Joanne, hold back. Get out of sight and be quiet." I pointed to the light. "If things start to get ugly, head back to the lobby as fast as you can. I've called the police already. Wait for them." It was good advice, and I should have taken it myself. But I couldn't let David take Linda away. That small dome light told me he was about to force the two women into a vehicle, and then they'd be gone. I stepped to the soft grass at the dark edge of the drive and approached carefully, reaching for the Beretta's grip. I got to within 20 yards when I heard their voices. I tiptoed closer, trying to make out the words. David held a gun on Linda. He jerked his head toward the Suburban, indicating for her to get inside. She stood her ground, her stocky body and legs apart stance telling him she wouldn't go willingly. I felt proud of her. Trudy stood by David's side, an eager look on her face. What the hell was she thinking? Trying to curry favor with the man who'd earlier left her for dead in a storage closet? Or going along with her partner? A confusion of possibilities rushed into my mind, but I put them aside. Right now, I had to get Linda out of this. I watched David's body language. He held the gun casually, like a man who wasn't used to handling a weapon. Although he waved it at Linda, his grip didn't look firm. Could I disarm him without his getting a shot off first? Trudy presented an unknown. She might turn on David, but I doubted it. At best, she might cave. At worst, she could easily turn on me. I edged closer, 15 yards away now. I held the Beretta in front of me and flicked off the safety. David's back presented an easy target to me. Despite the meager light, I had the advantage of close proximity and surprise. I could take him out. Ron had asked me, when he began teaching me to shoot, whether I'd be able to kill a person if the situation arose. I didn't know then, and I still didn't know. But I knew I'd be making that decision within the next few seconds. My hand wavered, then steadied. He'd killed once. If he became more aggressive with Linda, or if he turned on me, I could do it. I went over the steps in my mind, back at the target range. My hands went automatically to my two-handed grip. The gun was hot, safety off. I lined up the sights, gauging distance and angle. Linda's gaze flickered toward me. Oh God, this might be the moment. David didn't catch it. Linda returned her attention to his face, refusing to let her focus come back to me. Good girl. I said get in the car, he shouted. That time it came through loud and clear. Both of you! He shook Trudy off like a mosquito. This time Linda didn't resist. She climbed in and slid across the far side of the big vehicle. Trudy turned to David, a pleading look on her face. I want to ride up front with you, she whined. Get in the David looked at her, but she was looking at me. Oh shit, this is it. He shoved her aside and turned his gun toward me. His frantic gaze darted about, trying to figure out whether I was alone. I couldn't afford to wait until he got off the first shot. I aimed high, hoping I hadn't misread him. My shot went right where I placed it, over his head to the right of him, far into the forest. Trudy screamed and hit the ground. David's face crumpled in an almost comical way. His arms fell to his sides. Drop the gun! Way out there in front of the car! My voice came out much firmer than I'd anticipated, and he obeyed. Trudy, face down on the ground. Spread those arms. She too followed instructions. I liked this. Linda, get out of the car and grab his gun. Come over here by me. Her white face peered out of the dimly lit vehicle, and she looked pretty shaky. It's okay, I assured her. She did as I asked. David, down on the ground too. Over there. I waved the Beretta toward the front quarter of the Suburban. Flat on your face. arms out. You can't watch me. I re-aimed my gun and squinted to align the sights. You'll be in trouble. I'm a lawyer. Good point. I fired another shot over his head, pleased to see a wet spot form on the front of his pants. He dropped to the ground in a whimper. Chapter 30. I'd just about let loose a few choice words for the Santa Fe Police Department when a cruiser rolled up to the drive. I slipped my 2 spent casings into one pocket and the Beretta back under my jacket. Lay the gun on the ground and just tell your story as it was, I advised Linda. By the time David whined about being fired upon, for which he had no proof, and Trudy babbled on with loads of incriminating testimony about how they'd planned to be together and how she would stick by David and visit him in the pen, the 2 officers were beginning to look harried. Linda pointed out David's gun on the ground and explained how he'd used it to abduct her from Trudy's room. I gave them minimal information and suggested that they check with Detective Gallegos in the morning. Meanwhile, they agreed that both David and Trudy should be held on suspicion until then. The questions about my gun were starting to get a little tricky when my cell phone rang. I raised an eyebrow to the officer who'd been questioning me, and he nodded assent to answer it. Where are you? Drake asked. You were supposed to be here an hour ago. He sounded worried. Little delay. I'm with the police now? The officer beside me had heard Drake's voice clearly. Luckily, my husband knew better than to get into details over the phone. So, when will that be? He asked, lowering his voice. I got the distinct feeling there was something important he wasn't telling me. I'm not sure. Soon? I looked at the officer who was closing his notepad. I hope? He shook his head. Maybe not. Call me before you leave Santa Fe. With that, he hung up. I managed to stay composed until I'd given the officer my card, all my phone numbers, and my planned itinerary for the next 2 days. I confess that I fudged a little on the importance of my reasons for getting to Albuquerque, but it did gain me a smidgen of leeway. It occurred to me that I might report some inside information to Ron and Drake. I turned back to the officer. So will David be in jail for a few days? He wagged his head in a somewhat hopeless gesture. Don't bet on it. This guy has connections. I wouldn't be surprised if he's posted bond before I finish the paperwork tonight. That was discouraging. Linda was still in the middle of giving her statement when I left the driveway and made my way back to the resort. Gerald and Joanne, plus a small gathering of others from the conference, wanted all the juicy details, but I put them off. I managed to stay composed through all of that, but as I gathered my bags and started to leave the room, I lost it. I set everything down and gave in to the shakes and the tears. I could have killed a man tonight. More frightening was the fact that I knew I would have if he'd harmed Linda or turned on me. I'd been damn lucky that he'd shown that flicker of hesitation, that moment that told me he was more afraid of me than I was of him. He'd killed his own wife. I still wasn't sure of all the reasons why. But against an armed opponent, he'd back down. Some people are like that. I allowed myself a full 10 minutes of self-indulgent blubbering. Then I washed my face and brushed my hair and composed my face. I was rummaging in my purse for keys when Linda came in. We gave each other a tired stare, and I felt the rims of my eyes prickle again. I need to get going. Nope, I don't want you on the road, she said in her firmest doctorly voice. Linda, I already told Drake. I don't care. It's an hour-long drive, and you're too upset. I'm not! But the anger in my voice made her point. I was too upset. Stay here tonight. Calm down. Let me give you a sedative. Was the answer to everything found in a pill bottle? No drugs. I'll be better off if I just... I didn't know exactly what it would take. Okay then, let's go to the meditation session. It's still going and we could tiptoe in quietly. I just couldn't envision sitting in a big crowd and managing not to scream in frustration, especially with Calais' light in the room. My teeth gritted at the very idea. Linda, I just can't. I started to say that I couldn't stand the phony leader, but managed to couch it in softer wording. She looked disappointed, but didn't argue. You go. I'll be fine here in the room. She didn't buy it. I would bolt the minute she left, and she knew it. Let's go have a bowl of soup or something light. I'm serious about you staying here tonight. I wanted to pop out with a reminder that she's not my mother, a you're not the boss of me comment, but I held it. Let me call Drake first. He thinks I'm going to be on the road any minute. She went into the bathroom while I placed the call. I speed-dialed and asked him to give me a little more time. Despite the lateness of the hour, I was still determined to break out of this place yet tonight. Using the room phone, I ordered 2 bowls of soup. Linda was right about that. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten, and the lack of energy was dragging me down. I let her do the talking while we ate, but something about the conversation with Drake kept nagging at me. I got the idea that there was something he wasn't telling me, but didn't press it. Eventually, and when I wasn't quite so drained, I'd figure out all of it. Chapter 31. I awoke to the sensuous feeling of my body against my own sheets, the smell of Drake's aftershave lingering on the pillowcase next to mine. Unfortunately, he was not beside me. Noises from the kitchen pointed me in that direction, and I belted my cozy terry robe around me as I went. Hey there, he said, backing me against the fridge and kissing me. He tasted like blueberry muffins. Sensing my momentary distraction, he pointed toward the kitchen table. My favorite mug, steaming with coffee, and a plate with 2 bakery muffins sat at my usual place. Better have that so you can wake up. You were up way past your bedtime last night. No kidding. It had been close to 2 a.m. when I drove in, and I'd barely kissed him and fallen into bed before going unconscious. He topped off his own mug and rearranged the napkins in the holder, set the salt and pepper shakers straight for the 3rd time. What's the matter? I asked once I'd downed one of the muffins and realized that he was working his way up to telling me something. Manuel Salazar, one of the mechanics who worked on Mike Walter's ship. He died yesterday. Pretty sure it was suicide. What? How? I don't know details. Rick Valdez got the call just as we were leaving the deposition yesterday. Why didn't you tell me last night? He shrugged. It was late. You had a lot on your mind. True, but he certainly could have interrupted me for this. I watched his fingers trace circles on the table for a minute. Hon, you're not somehow blaming yourself for this, are you? Another shrug. You can't have caused the guy to be that depressed. I mean, surely... Maybe not depressed. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he thought we were about to haul him into court and accuse him of causing the accident. He was real nervous when Ron and I talked to him. But... I couldn't think of anything else to say. He exhaled loudly and stood up. I know. I can't really believe that I caused it, but still, it's bothering me. I walked over to where he stood staring out the window into the backyard. I put my arms around him and laid my cheek against the back of his shirt, stroked his chest with my hands. Okay, your turn. He turned around to face me. My turn? To spill the beans. There was a message on the home phone from a Detective Gallegos in Santa Fe. What? Why didn't you tell me? What happened last night with David Ratwell? And why did Gallegos want you to know he's out on bond? Out why? Let's make some breakfast and I'll fill you in. I had a feeling bacon and eggs would be a necessity. I scrambled eggs and made them into sandwiches and carried 2 plates to the living room. Curled into one corner of the sofa, I gave Drake time to reappear, freshly showered and wearing a soft pair of flannels and a t-shirt, before I launched into the recount of the week's events. From the threat on the massage table to my bump on the head in the parking lot, I went over it all. He stopped me once in a while to clarify some minor point, but mainly he let me talk. He actually let out a little snicker when I told him about David wetting his pants as the shot went over his head. And David Ratwell, the same attorney who's been ragging me over the helicopter crash, probably killed his own wife and is now out on bond. He was pacing the living room by now, unable to relax and just enjoy my little tale. I nodded and drained the last of my coffee while Rusty cleaned up the scraps of toast and egg from my plate. I'm going to have a hard time not punching him when I see him, you know, he told me when he finally finished pacing. And what good is that going to do? I set the mug on the coffee table. I don't know for a fact that it was David who knocked me out or who locked up Trudy. In fact, I don't see how it could be, now that I look back at it. Even if he raced out of your deposition, he couldn't have made it back to Santa Fe and up to Casa de Tranquilidad in under an hour. Someone else must have done that little bit of dirty work. He stopped with a jolt. But David left the deposition early. I wasn't told why, but the other attorney from his firm handled all the questioning all afternoon. David could have easily been back in Santa Fe. Now I felt myself go still inside. All along I'd felt that David was the one who pushed Rita, but until he held Linda at gunpoint, I never quite fully believed that he'd also come after me and after Trudy. I'd been sure that her fantasies about David were just that. Now I had to rethink that whole idea. Did Gallegos want me to call him back? Didn't really say. The message is still on the machine if you want to go listen. I checked in and wrote down the number he gave, which matched that of the police station from his business card. I've got to go out to the airport and re-examine that helicopter wreckage. Do you want to come along? Unless you think I know something about the engine that you don't, I better stay here and return Gallegos' call. As it turned out, I decided to get my thoughts together before talking to the Santa Fe cop. Last night's events were still eating at me. First thing I did was to retrieve the memory card with the documents I'd stolen off Stanworthy's computer. I couldn't think of him as Calais Light once I was away from the insulated atmosphere at Casa de Tranquilidad. The guy was a businessman, no matter what his followers might want to think, and I had to believe that meeting with David Ratwell that I accidentally witnessed days ago at McDonald's was going to be key to some kind of connection with Rita. How could it not be? Rita works in David's office for several years before they're split up. She's institutionalized for a while, manipulated by David. Then shows up a couple of years later working at Light's place as a yoga instructor. At the same time, Trudy, the now out-of-work nurse, just happens to enroll in the Lightness Conference, and Trudy has a huge infatuation with David. It was all too much. I ruminated over all this as the pages of the document printed out. The money transfers offshore were huge. I added up the various amounts shown on Stanworthy's spreadsheets. Setting that aside for the moment, I took out my little pocket spiral notebook and a large yellow pad. I transferred the few notes from the spiral and filled in the gaps, detailing everything in sequence, from the warning I'd received in the massage room to my own knocked unconscious episode in the parking lot, to the showdown in the woods. David's peeping episode into Trudy's window was curious, to say the least, and I had to wonder at her insistence that it had been David she was meeting when she was lured to the locker room and stuffed into the closet. Later, when I caught up with them in the woods, she hadn't been afraid of David. She'd actually been hanging all over him as though the two of them planned to run away together. And Rita, what truly was the story there? If David had pushed his wife over the wall to her death, why on earth had he come back to Casa de Tranquilidad several more times? Logic would seem to tell me that a killer would stay away. But then they always say that the murderer returns to the scene of the crime. My head felt fuzzy, trying to sort it all out. The phone rang just then, and I realized it was noon when the caller turned out to be Drake. He asked if I had planned on his coming back for lunch, and seemed relieved to have the extra time without having to come home. Said he was finding the evidence he needed and would probably be there a couple more hours. Drake's call reminded me that I hadn't reached Gallegos in Santa Fe yet. but I wasn't quite ready to talk to him. The fact that he hadn't been able to hold David Ratwell even a day bothered me as surely as all the strange links in the case. My notes were piling up, and I felt like the answer had to be here somewhere. I just couldn't figure out where. Rusty began to nudge at my leg, and I realized he hadn't been out in hours. "Let's go for a walk." The magic word was walk, and he headed for the front door. I grabbed up my jacket and his leash, and we walked toward the park 2 blocks away. The autumn sky was brilliant with its typical deep blue, and I wondered why on earth I'd spent the whole morning indoors. We might have another month or so of this fabulous weather before winter set in. I needed to make the most of it. I willed all thoughts of the case out of my head, clearing space for answers, I hoped. We circled the park and found it deserted. The neighborhood is still mainly older people, and they tend to stick pretty close to their own territory. The real outdoor girl of the whole lot is Elsa, with her huge garden every year. I let Rusty off the leash, and he sniffed at the ground for a while. "Hey, old man," I teased as I clipped the leash back on. "Let's head home." He trotted beside me, sprightly enough, and drank about 3 quarts of water when we got back to the house. I debated making myself a little lunch, but the 2 muffins and egg sandwich had taken their toll on my appetite. I went back into Drake's office, where I'd left all my papers piled on the desk. The dog eventually came in and flopped down beside me with all the energy of an old rag. Lethargy was trying to set in, and I dropped into Drake's desk chair and began to gather my pages. 2 unmarked folders lay there, and I absently flipped one of them open. There was my answer, staring me right in the face. Chapter 32. It took me a minute to place the face. The maintenance man who'd been around Casa de Tranquilidad. He'd stepped into the yoga room looking for Rita the first day. I'd passed him in the corridor at least once, near Trudy's room. The unkempt blonde hair and 4-day beard growth were the same in the photo. It was a mugshot. The attached report showed an arrest 4 years earlier for trafficking in stolen merchandise. I dialed Drake's cell phone, and he picked up immediately. "Leo Malone?" he said once I described how I found the picture. "He's a mechanic who is probably behind our crash. We think he failed to safety wire that engine nut, and then conned Manny Salazar into signing off the maintenance record. That mugshot comes from an arrest for dealing in stolen aircraft parts. He got a year probation and a fine. I think he's tied in with Rita's death." "He knows David Ratwell. Ron and I saw them meeting." And a few more pieces fell into place. I dialed the number for Detective Gallegos in Santa Fe. "Before you even get started, Ms. Parker, I'll let you know that we weren't able to hold David Ratwell. Brought him in last night, but the most we could charge him with was aggravated assault. He never took Dr. Casper off the resort grounds, so we can't really make a case for kidnapping. And Trudy Blanchard refuses to press any charges against him at all. She says they are in love, and were just planning to go away together. Your whole story about him tying her up and leaving her in a closet, she won't confirm it." I gritted my teeth, almost wishing I hadn't rescued her. "He's already out on bond today and making threatening noises about pressing charges against you for shooting at him." Not surprising. I didn't give up. "I think he had an accomplice, Leo Malone. He's got a record. Malone is implicated in causing a helicopter crash a couple of years ago. It's also connected with David Ratwell." There was a minute of silence, during which I could hear computer keys clicking in the background. "Yeah, I got something here on Malone. Last known address is Albuquerque. That's out of our jurisdiction. I don't think I can do anything about him." What about various departments working together? What about actually trying to solve this crime? I wanted to demand answers, but felt on shaky ground still about the shooting incident. He'd closed up by then anyway, and he ended the call by telling me that there was nothing more he could do. Chapter 33. My blood pressure spiked. I could feel it. Why did I let the detective get to me like that? I leaned back in the chair and stared up at the ceiling, letting my head hang back. Tried sitting upright and meditating for a couple of minutes, but my mind was racing. Linda probably never would get me to be disciplined enough for this. Shirley had tried to teach us as well. Why wasn't I getting it? Shirley. A scene popped into my head, standing in Shirley's office, a casual mention of Rita's personal belongings, a tote bag on the floor. She told me that the police left Rita's things with her at the conference center. Now that the conference was over, could I catch her in time? I grabbed for the phone, fumbled it, shuffled through the papers until I found the number. "Shirley?" My voice came out kind of squeaky when the female voice answered. It was Nikki, but she put me through. "Shirley, do you still happen to have Rita Ratwell's belongings?" I blurted out the question without even introducing myself, but I backtracked and tried for the niceties. "I think so, Charlie. Let me check. Wait a minute." I heard drawers and doors thunking. "Here it is. I'd put it away in my credenza." The police in Santa Fe don't seem to have enough evidence to get serious about an arrest, and I'd really like to look through Rita's things. Something in her tote bag might provide some clues. The minute I mentioned the police, I wished I hadn't. She might decide to turn it over to them instead. But she didn't seem to care about that. "I'm leaving in about 15 minutes to drive some of our people to the Albuquerque airport. I could meet you somewhere, but I don't have much leeway time. A couple of flights have tight connections." "Which airline? I'll meet you near the check-in counters." A little over an hour later, I was sitting on the ottoman-type bench near the entry doors when she came in. I watched her shepherd 3 people toward one airline's counter and a couple more to another. She had Rita's tote bag over one arm and an extra purse strap on that same shoulder. A quick greeting, and she seemed glad to be rid of the extra weight. Much as I wanted to dig right in, I drove all the way home and put the purse and tote on the dining table before opening either one. When I dumped the contents, the purse appeared to contain a woman's normal collection of junk: wallet, keys, lipstick, a hairbrush, 2 old shopping lists with the items crossed off, some breath mints, 2 ballpoint pens. The tote bag contained her teaching materials, mainly cassette tapes, a sweater, headband, a spiral notebook. I spread the tapes across the table, a motley collection of home recordings mixed with professional ones. Most were labeled with Sanskrit-sounding words. One tape was not labeled. I found a tape player and popped it in. Chapter 34. Rita's voice came through, a whisper, scared, not the pushy dominatrix from our yoga classes. "David's guy, that Leo, he's stalking me. I've seen him twice when I'm out shopping. Once I was in my car and saw him in a big white pickup. He drove right up behind me to freak me out." A loud sigh and long pause. When she spoke again, the voice was ragged. "He's really scaring me. I think he's going to kill me." She paused for a full minute but didn't stop the tape. I heard wishy sounds, as if she were pulling a blanket around her. "In case he does get me, I think I better tell the whole story." Again a pause as she gathered her thoughts. "David is moving money offshore. He put a lot of it in my name, thinking he would avoid taxes. But he knew I wanted to leave him and thought he could get rid of me by sticking me in that place. While I was there, he did something else with the money. I never found the records." A sudden thump sounded on the tape and she shrieked. "Oh, Cleo, what are you doing?" Her voice became tender and a cat's meow explained the interruption. She spoke to the cat for a few moments before she seemed to remember the tape. "Where was I? Oh yeah, David and the money. I don't know if that's the reason Leo is following me now. I heard something else." My interest perked up. "After I got out of the hospital, David insisted I work in his law office. He acted nice, made it sound like he really wanted us to be closer again. I think he just wanted to keep tabs on me, to make sure he knew where I was all the time. I was still a little fuzzy on the time frame here, trying to remember how long Rita worked for David, but her voice pulled me back to the tape. One night, I was there later than David thought. He told me to go home at 5 and start making dinner, but there was some extra filing. I'd gotten behind and it made him mad. So I stayed that night because I knew he had a conference call and wouldn't go home right away. While I was in the file room, I heard the back door open and David went to greet someone. It was Leo, but I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know Leo. David didn't invite him in. They just stood by the back door and talked, and I was on the other side of the wall from them. I stayed really quiet. The cat meowed again. I wished it would stay really quiet. Leo said some stuff about his job as a mechanic, then something about a helicopter crash. I remember that because David answered him back like, "Yeah, it was a mistake, that's what you'll say." Kind of wink-wink, nudge-nudge, if that makes sense. But Leo didn't like it. He said he better leave the state. He wanted to just get away. David said that Leo couldn't leave yet because there was still that other matter. That's what he said. That other matter. Then he said they'd talk about it tomorrow, and he kind of shoved Leo out because the phone was starting to ring, and it was that conference call. She sighed loudly on the tape. So, anyways, I just stood there like a statue, and I heard the back door close, and then I heard David talking on the speakerphone, and once it seemed like he was busy with that, I went really quietly back to my desk and got my purse and keys and started to get the heck out of there. And then, God, this is so dumb. I bumped my desk and a coffee cup crashed to the floor, and then David called out. But the people on the line were asking him what's wrong, and so he didn't come after me. But he knew it was me. I know he did. And I know he figured out that I'd heard him talking to Leo. The money from that big chemical lawsuit is gone. He's moved it somewhere. He'll just disappear and no one will ever know what he did. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. She must have gone home and packed her things, made the tape as insurance. I picked up the cassette case again to see if there were any markings on it, a date, anything. But there wasn't. I tried to create a timeline of events, but I couldn't be sure. I could guess that the Ratwells, once Rita was released from Peaceful Haven, had moved to Santa Fe, maybe as a place to hide away from California authorities. Who knew? She'd worked in David's office for a few weeks or months until she overheard David's conversation with Leo. Then clearly she felt like she had to get out. But instead of going very far away, she'd stayed in town and just picked a new career. Dumb move. Why hadn't she moved across the country, changed her name, really disappeared? Remembering Rita's flighty ways and disorganization, I guessed that she just didn't plan that far ahead. Now we would probably never know. Her guess that David and Leo would try to get rid of her, though, seemed accurate. I couldn't prove who gave the actual push over the wall, but I knew one of them did. Chapter 35. I knew the Santa Fe police weren't going to take the investigation any further than they'd already done. Why? In a town that size, you never knew. Maybe David's law firm wielded some influence. Maybe the cops were satisfied with their accidental death ruling and didn't want to put in the extra work. But Gallegos' statement that Leo Malone lived outside their jurisdiction was the real clincher. Case closed for them. I tapped my pen on the dining table. Well, if Santa Fe wouldn't work the case because Malone lived in Albuquerque, then I would get the Albuquerque police involved. I caught Ron at the office and got the direct phone number for Kent Taylor, the homicide detective who is really my one and only inside link at the APD. It took about 20 minutes, but I laid out the whole story. Rita's fall, David and Leo both hanging around the resort, how a huge amount of money from the Ace Chem settlement had disappeared, the weird relationship that seemed to exist between Trudy Blanchard and David. I even told about the confrontation in the woods, although I glossed over the fact that I'd actually fired my gun. Told him what Gallegos had told me about closing the case. He asked a few questions, but otherwise didn't interrupt as I basically related everything that had happened during the last week, including the fact that David's law firm was trying very hard to get a huge settlement in the helicopter case. My opinion was that David couldn't resist one last big money score, but that he was certainly taking a risk if he were hoping that Rita's death would be ruled accidental. With Santa Fe PD dropping their investigation, he probably felt pretty safe now. Over the phone, I could hear Taylor hitting a few keys on the keyboard.
"There's a note in the database that the police questioned you about firing a weapon, Charlie."
Uh-oh, the one area of shaky ground for me. I don't think they found any evidence of that, except that Mr. Ratwell was somehow frightened into wetting his pants. I suppose he could pursue me in civil court if he wants that fact to become public. Kent didn't see the humor in that.
"Well, if the Santa Fe PD wants a signed statement from you, we'll call you and you can come downtown."
I certainly didn't relish that idea, at all. I hung up, a little less sure of myself. Deciding I'd done about all I could for the moment, I gathered Rita's belongings back into her purse and tote bag. Maybe I could find someone at Casa de Tranquilidad who knew how to contact whoever should get her things. I set the 2 bags in the guest room and headed to the kitchen. There was still a ton of unanswered questions. Who really pushed Rita? What was David's connection with Leo? I mean, why did Leo show up at David's office to tell him about the helicopter's maintenance records? Was this before or after David's firm had taken that case? And of course, I had to ask myself, what was I going to make for dinner? Since I'd been away for most of the week and poor Drake had fended for himself, it kind of fell to me to be the provider tonight. Other than Elsa's bag of tomatoes, I wasn't seeing a lot of options in the fridge. Rummaging in the cabinets netted me a package of spaghetti and a jar of sauce. A quick trip to the store and I could add a salad and some garlic bread and call it good. Drake would undoubtedly be able to add some extra things to a bottled sauce to make it truly fabulous, but that was a little beyond me at this moment. I grabbed my keys and wallet and convinced Rusty that he really didn't need to go along on the 10-minute trip. There's a little market just a few blocks from the house, which is a lot more convenient than any of the huge chain supermarkets. A quicker trip and fewer parking hassles, so that's where I headed. I told myself to drop all thoughts of the investigation, including the nagging possibility that a lawyer like David Ratwell would most certainly be the type who would haul me into court in a heartbeat. I let myself revel in the variety of fresh lettuces, and I acted like a real connoisseur of fine produce as I checked for the very best cucumbers in the bin. Since I'm completely missing the gardening gene, this is about as close to the farmer instinct as I ever get. I chose my salad ingredients, grabbed a fresh baguette in the bakery section, and headed back toward my Jeep. The rest of it happened in a blur. I'd barely clicked the remote door lock when I sensed movement behind me. A white van, an iron-like grip clamping my arms to my sides, my feet leaving the ground. Chapter 36. Drake walked around the engine wreckage one more time, then shut off his digital camera. He'd probably taken 4 dozen close-ups of the parts in question, with at least half of those focused on the place where the missing nut should be. Every conceivable angle, every properly wired bolt to show the contrast with the one improperly done. Would it be good enough evidence to convince the attorneys? Who could guess? His head was beginning to pound. He arrived home to find Rusty anxiously waiting by the front door. No sign of Charlie.
"Hey, boy."
He rubbed the dog's ears.
"Didn't you get your dinner yet?"
Keying on that important word, Rusty spun and headed for the kitchen. His dish was empty, but that was no surprise. This wasn't a critter who left spare food lying around. Drake supposed a little more wouldn't hurt, so he scooped a few nuggets. Charlie could let him know whether to add more later. Where was she, anyway? A kettle of water sat on the stove, cold, with a package of spaghetti and an unopened jar of sauce on the countertop. It was pretty clear what her intentions were for their own dinner. Maybe she'd gone next door to borrow something to finish it out. He walked into their bedroom, didn't see her, spent a couple of minutes washing his face and combing his hair, went back to the kitchen and pulled a beer from the fridge. Debated walking over to Elsa's house, but it looked dark over there. Settling in front of the TV sounded more appealing than getting hooked into female conversation at this moment. He headed toward the living room when the blinking light on the answering machine caught his attention, and he set his beer down.
Miss Parker, this is Cindy at Hudson's Market. We wanted to let you know that a customer found your wallet out in the parking lot and turned it in. We'll have it at the customer service desk for you. Thanks.
Charlie's wallet in a parking lot. The hairs on his neck rose.
Chapter 37. I fought panic, trying desperately to think, to calmly rationalize my situation and decide what to do. But with duct tape wound around my ankles and wrists and strips of it over my eyes and mouth, leaving only my somewhat stuffy nostrils to grant me a scant amount of musty air, terror loomed right at the surface. I felt about a nanosecond from completely losing it. The one rational thought that I could conjure up was that I would probably lose all my eyelashes when that tape was ripped off. I nearly laughed at the sad realization that this was suddenly important to me, but I couldn't even grab enough air for a small chuckle to form. Get a grip, Charlie. If nothing else, just take stock. I was in the back of a white van. I knew that much. There were two men. I could hear their voices, vaguely sensed both of them, although I'd not gotten a look at their faces. Grabbed from behind and dragged into the vehicle, I'd barely had a chance to kick out before the shock of having my eyes taped, then my mouth. One of them sat on me and bound my ankles, adding another wrap at the knees, while the other taped my wrists and then looped that wrap around the one at my knees. I felt like a trussed bird waiting for the axe on the neck. All those sick news stories filled my head with lurid details of women whose bodies were found out on the mesas, raped, murdered, buried in shallow graves. Hopelessness threatened to simply take over, but instead the images just made me mad. I'm not a victim type. I'm very careful, very aware of my surroundings. Always. I'd not been overburdened with bags, nor was I daydreaming when they grabbed me. The horrifying thing was how fast it had all happened, the squeal of the tires, the steely grip that disabled me. I forced myself to relax my muscles and pulled in all the air I could get. My head cleared a little. The men's voices seemed far away. They were both up front, while I must be at the back of the van's cavernous interior. I scraped my face against the rough carpeting, trying to catch the edges of the tape. A dozen or more firm brushes, and I felt the tug of adhesive on carpet. The tape in my eyes was sticking to the floor, so I rolled with it and got it peeled away from one eye. I was right. Pulling out the lashes really did hurt like crazy. 2 solid blinks, and I gained a little focus. My guess about the 2 men was correct. The larger man was driving, blondish or light brown hair, haloed by the setting sun outside. We were heading west, and the steady thunk, thunk, thunk made me think of the sound of tires on a bridge. And if that were the case, we were probably on I-40 crossing the Rio Grande. They were conversing, but the noise level was too great for me to hear them. I used the same carpet rub maneuver to expose my mouth and sucked in deep breaths. Even the combination of carpet fibers, dust, and something like old motor oil that lingered in the air seemed like an elixir. I filled my lungs and exhaled several times, feeling stronger immediately. If only I could get the tape off my hands. I put my proven method to work again, but we'd now left the evenly paced speed of the interstate, and I had a hard time not rolling side to side as the van took an exit ramp a little too fast, sped up for a brief time, then squealed the brakes for a traffic light. I lay very still, guessing that this would be the moment when one of them would look back to check on me. I don't know whether they did. The light must have changed because we lurched into motion again. I pictured the layout of the city's west side. Coors Road was the most developed area, with many traffic signals and in the late afternoon, bumper-to-bumper traffic. The fact that we'd already stopped once made me think this is where we were. The van turned, stopped, idled. Someone came up to the passenger side and they talked through the window. I got a fuzzy impression of some kind of package being passed through the van. The third man walked away, and we started moving again. If they'd been smarter about getting rid of me, they would probably have driven farther west, out into more open space. Then again, I could be all wrong, I realized, as the vehicle picked up speed. Chapter 38.
Ron, I need your help.
He knew his voice sounded ragged, but he couldn't seem to control that. He gave about a 2-sentence synopsis, although for all he knew, he might have babbled for minutes.
Okay, Drake, I'm coming right over. She talked to Kent Taylor this afternoon. I'm going to call him on the way and see if he might know anything pertinent.
Drake paced the entire house. At his desk in the room he used for an office, he spotted the folder from his investigation, open to the mug shot of Leo Malone. He plucked the photo from the file, glanced around, but didn't see much else that might be of use. It would be dark soon. From the garage, he grabbed 2 strong flashlights and a small toolbox that he kept on hand with basics. In the bedroom, he yanked a sweatshirt from his side of the closet, then reached into Charlie's side to get one of hers, too. She'd probably gone to the store wearing no more than jeans and a t-shirt on the warm autumn day. While he was at it, he picked up her favorite boots, some extra socks, a blanket that they had sometimes added to the bed on cold winter nights. He stuffed it all into a duffel. Into his waistband he jammed his Colt .45, the pistol with which he was most accurate at the target range. Just in case. Ron's Mustang roared up in the driveway. Why hadn't he noticed that Charlie's Jeep was gone when he first got home? He could have saved at least 30 minutes, maybe more if he'd just been more alert. Rusty waited at the door, wanting to go along. Drake debated. Would the dog actually be of help, or would he simply get in the way? The moment he opened the front door, though, Rusty pushed his way through and ran directly to Ron's car. Drake grabbed up Charlie's jacket that hung on the rack by the door, slung the duffel over his shoulder, and locked up after himself.
Should we take my truck? We might get off the roads.
Sure. Ron opened the passenger door and gave Rusty a push toward the small back seat.
What did Kent Taylor say?
Drake asked as he started the engine and put it in gear.
Gave me some names. Leo Malone, David Ratwell. Is this something tied to our crash investigation?
I don't know.
She mentioned that Ratwell was related to that yoga instructor who died out at the spa.
She thought he might have had something to do with that.
Yeah, she had me do some background work on several people at that place.
Drake had backed out of the driveway and realized that he didn't have a clue where to go first. Ron filled in.
Let's start with the market where they found her wallet.
5 minutes later, they pulled into the small parking lot that edged one side of the squarish cinder block building. No windows faced the lot at all. They were all in the front, facing the street. At the small customer service desk, they asked for the girl who had placed the call, Cindy. I didn't see anything myself. A customer came in with this wallet and said someone must have dropped it in the parking lot. Oh, and there were some keys. She reached into a drawer and pulled them out. They were definitely Charlie's, and Drake felt his breath catch.
Who was the customer? Would he or she still be here?
Ron asked. Oh, Mrs. Baca. She lives on the next street over, usually walks here to do her shopping. Just picked up some bread and eggs and...
I don't want to be rude, but we don't need to know her whole list. We think my wife may have been kidnapped out there. Can we speak to Mrs. Baca?
Ron asked, his voice more normal than Drake could even hope for right now.
And how about anyone else who was in the store at the time? Which other employees were here?
Cindy finally seemed to grasp their rush. I'm the assistant manager. 2 cashiers are on duty. She nodded toward the busy checkout lanes. The produce manager and butcher both go home earlier in the day.
I doubt the cashiers would have seen anything outside.
You got that right. When you're checking out the customers, you don't see anything but the groceries and the customer who's standing right in front of you. Maybe Randy. She paged a young man, the only bag boy on the shift. He came forward, giving Drake and Ron a look, probably wondering if they were cops. Once they assured him that they were not going to hassle him, he opened up.
Are you talking about the green Jeep that's been out there quite a while? Where Mrs. Baca said she found the wallet?
He shuffled a little.
Well, the only thing I could think of was maybe an hour ago. I was pushing Mr. Guthrie's cart out for him, and this white van just screamed out of the lot. It was near that green Jeep when I first saw it, so I don't know if it's connected. But man, that thing just peeled out and laid rubber.
The van. That might be important, Randy. Was there anything painted on it? Signs, logos, business markings? The teen was shaking his head through all this. License plates. Did you notice at all?
No, Flicker.
New Mexico or out of state. Can you picture anything in your mind?
New Mexico, I'm pretty sure. The old-fashioned bright yellow ones with red letters. It made a left turn out of the lot, down at the far end, onto San Carlos Street. So I got a good look at the side. No design or anything on it. It was just solid white, the kind without windows.
Drake was anxious to get moving.
Oh, there was one thing. It had 2 ladders on top of it, like the cable guys have sometimes, or those installers for satellite TV or something.
But no company logos.
No, sir. I'm really sure about that.
The driver? Did you get a look?
Randy scratched at his peach fuzz face and thought.
A man. Seemed like a big guy. I don't know what he was wearing. I think I saw a red sleeve, like a windbreaker or something like that. And I think there was somebody else with him, in the passenger seat. I'm not really sure about that.
They thanked the kid and the manager and walked outside. Drake felt discouraged by so little information.
So, a plain white van with 2 ladders on top. Ladders that they could easily dump off anywhere. Maybe 1 person, maybe 2.
Ron's cell phone rang and he snatched it from his jacket pocket.
Parker.
Drake watched anxiously as Ron mm-hmmed a few times, then relayed what they just learned about the van. He picked up the pace toward Drake's truck as he clicked off the call.
Kent Taylor called an APB. It's the closest thing to an Amber Alert they can do for an adult abductee. I gave him the info on the van. Well, you heard that part. He already knew most of it. Ran registration checks for vehicles owned by our suspects and their employers. The FBO that Leo Malone works for owns a couple of white vans. They're thinking he may have borrowed one of them. And what are they actually doing? He didn't say. Probably the best that they can. Let's go out to Double Eagle. We got maybe an hour before it's pitch dark.
The trip to the far west side airport had probably never been driven so quickly. Still, with rush hour traffic and the distance they had to cover, Drake knew there would only be another 30 minutes of light, if they were lucky. He, Ron, and the dog piled into the Jet Ranger and he cranked up.
This may be a waste of time, but I have to do something.
Chapter 39. I didn't know how long we'd been driving, but it must be close to an hour by now. After the exit past the river, there had been a series of stops and turns, acceleration, and then steady highway driving for a long time. I could imagine that we might be back on Interstate 40, but really, I had to admit that I didn't have any real idea. I continued to sneak blurry, one-eyed peeks toward the 2 men in front, except for an occasional glance my way by one in the passenger seat. They seemed pretty unconcerned about me. I guess they were thoroughly familiar with the wonders of duct tape and felt like I was pretty secure. I let them think that. With my hands tied in front of me, I could have wiggled enough to reach up and pull off the rest of the strips covering my eyes and mouth, but that would definitely give away the fact that I was working my way loose. I'd rather they thought I was out of it. Meanwhile, I rubbed at the wrist tape, picked at it, rubbed some more. I was making a little progress, and from what I could tell by feel, they had only done a once-around loop there. It provided a glimmer of hope. If only I had a sharp object. Unfortunately, I didn't have a single thing on me but my clothing. Thank goodness for that. My wallet and keys and the bag of groceries were no doubt strewn around the parking lot at the market. I latched onto the hope that someone would use that information to come looking for me, not to merely steal my identity. I used my one eye to scan the small portion of the van that I could see, but nothing presented a solution. So I continued to pick. The van slowed noticeably. Oh, shit. This is one case when the kid in the back does not want to get there any faster. I raised my head a little, trying to hear what the men were saying. I caught one word. Cops. It wasn't the word they wanted, apparently, because the van suddenly whipped around, squealing and throwing me violently against the wheel well on the driver's side. I had a really bad feeling that we were headed into oncoming traffic. Chapter 40. Drake was thankful that Ron had so willingly hopped aboard the helicopter with him, knowing that being airborne was not his brother-in-law's favorite state. However, being on the telephone was Ron's normal state, and he was handling it quite well. He'd gotten Kent Taylor to talk to someone in charge at APD, who allowed them to use the police frequency, so they knew there were extra patrols around the city. "Remind them that Leo Malone works in Gallup," he told Ron, who was currently working at getting APD to alert the state police to the situation as well. From the radio chatter, Drake thought they were probably monitoring I-40 westbound, but mere hope wasn't enough. He'd set a heading to follow the interstate himself. If the white van had hit the freeway immediately and stayed, as he assumed they would, close to the speed limit, they couldn't be much farther than the town of Grants by now. He kept the Jet Ranger about 500 feet off the deck and scanned every vehicle. Darkness was closing in fast. Chapter 41. Oh my God! The van rocked dangerously. Squealing brakes and horns sounded outside. I waited for the impact that would surely kill me. The van veered downward and I braced myself as well as possible to avoid rolling all the way to the front. I used the moment of noise and confusion to rip the last of the tape from my wrists, my eyes, my mouth. I was clawing for the ends of the pieces at my knees and ankles as we bounced across the dirt median and up the other side. This time, I had no chance to stop myself from rolling out of control toward the back doors. A scream tried to form in my throat, but I held it back. If those doors were to come open, I didn't want to picture the mass of Charlie Hamburger roadkill. I kept picking at the tape edges, searching in the almost complete darkness for a weakness that I could use to simply rip the stuff off my legs. The van threatened to roll as it hit the upslope of the eastbound lanes. I gave up any pretense of remaining wrapped up and spread my arms to avoid slamming to the other side of the cargo space again. I was already going to be one big nasty bruise. Up front, there was a fair amount of cursing going on. The driver was clearly at the limit of his abilities, and the passenger somehow thought that shouting his displeasure would change that. I found a decent rip in the tape at my ankles and gave it a hard pull, savoring the sucking sound it made as it peeled away from my jeans. But the sound drew attention from the front. The passenger turned fully in his seat and stared at me. It was David Ratwell. Chapter 42. Almost calmly, I told myself that I should have known who grabbed me. Ratwell and Leo Malone were really the only choice. All that self-talk about rape and abduction and identity theft seemed a little silly now. Clearly, the whole goal was murder. That thought had roughly a tenth of a second to fit through my head before David barreled between the seats and came at me. He only failed to remember that a woman's strength lies in her hips and legs, and since mine were still tightly bound at the knees, I had a fairly good weapon right there. I kicked out and got him right in the face. His nose gushed blood, his eyes rolled back, and he went down hard. For good measure, I gave another solid kick to his left collarbone, but he was out cold, limp as a stuffed toy. Leo managed to get the van somewhat under control and was standing on the horn to make other vehicles get out of our way. When David's dead weight landed with a crash, Leo turned to look back at the ruckus. Bad move. The van went squirrely and began to shimmy hard. I rattled around in there a bit, and Leo's attention went right back to the road. Red and blue lights began to flicker in the rearview mirrors. I started to offer up a little thank you prayer, but that turned out to be a little premature. Leo regained control and floored it. I found myself against the back doors again, grabbing around for anything that might save me from flying out the back if they came open. The van was completely utilitarian, unfinished on the inside, so there were some metal crossbars and struts along the sides. I ripped off my remaining duct tape and inched up the side of the cargo space, gripping them whenever I could. "You fool!" I screamed at Leo. "You'll never outrun them!" "Doesn't this jerk watch TV?" He pulled a gun and aimed it over his right shoulder. That shut me up pretty quickly. I edged over to his side of the vehicle, figuring it would be harder for him to hit me at that kind of angle. Nudged David again, but he was still limp as a rag. Beyond his body, I got glimpses of a spare tire mounted to the side of the compartment, at the rear. And where there's a tire, there must be... Yep, the tire iron was there, neatly fitted into a bracket. I grabbed it and yanked. I had no idea what I would do. Clearly whacking Leo from the back while we were moving at 85 miles an hour wasn't smart. I edged forward again, scooting my newfound weapon along the carpet with me. Chapter 43. Drake stared out into the night. The last of the glow in the west was fading quickly. Ahead, the westbound stream of cars had slowed, brake lights flaring as drivers realized it. "Man the spotlight," he called out to Ron, showing him the handle and switch. Ron tested it, getting the feel for aiming it. "Something's going on. Looks like a half-dozen emergency vehicles at least. I don't like it." He slowed airspeed as they caught up to the line of traffic. "I think it's a roadblock." Below them, a vehicle suddenly whipped out of the westbound lane, bumped its way across the median, and climbed the embankment to the eastbound lanes. "Shine the light. Is that our van?" Ron worked the handle and finally spotlighted the one. 2 ladders on top. "What can we do?" he shouted toward Drake. "Just keep the lights steady. I'll hover right over it." A couple of miles down the road, he saw that 2 of the state cruisers had seen them. Lights blazing, they came after the van. The other traffic had pretty much come to a stop, cars pulling off to the sides everywhere. "He's going close to 90. I'm tracking him." Over the radio, Drake heard the pursuing officers order someone ahead to lay out the tire strips. He held his breath. What would the strips do at this speed? What if the driver saw the strips in advance and went off the road? What would he do if they'd hurt Charlie? Chapter 44. A bright light shone down on the van, and I had the fleeting feeling that maybe heaven was calling me. One of those bright light in the tunnel things? Then I heard the overhead thrum of rotor blades, and a huge feeling of relief rushed over me. Unfortunately, Leo heard them too. He slowed down enough, barely to take his eyes off the road for a second. Pointing the gun at me, he said, "I didn't think anything of bringing down one helicopter, you know, and pushing Rita over that wall wasn't too bad either. So don't think I won't shoot you and then take out your nosy expert witness husband. Threaten me all you want, but don't threaten to take away the guy who has made my life so happy." Without hesitation, I raised the tire iron and smacked his wrist. The pistol dropped behind the passenger seat and I snatched it up. "It's time to stop the van, Leo." Chapter 45. Linda Casper and I got together for lunch a week later. I'd spent the week babying my sore muscles and bruises, hiding my stiffness from her as best as I could when we met up. I wondered again about the woman I'd run into at Casa de Tranquilidad, Samantha Sweet, whose brief touch had seemingly healed my head wound. I would have loved to see if the same magic worked on my current condition. As we filled our plates at Soup R Salad's long salad bar, Linda asked how my interview with the police went. It took me a moment to shuffle everything in my mind and remember which interview she was talking about. There had been so many. I'd watched through the glass as Leo Malone was interrogated, got to see his admission that he'd stalked Rita in Santa Fe at David's demand, blackmailed by David because of his involvement in the cause of Mike Walters' fatal helicopter crash, gossip in the corridors at Casa de Tranquilidad, had told him what he needed to know to track Rita's movements and catch her alone in the courtyard. In a maintenance uniform, he'd blended in and gotten access to all parts of the spa and hotel. The police weren't convinced that Manny Salazar's death was a suicide. Clearly, Malone saw Manny as a weak link and may have chosen to eliminate him. That particular investigation was just beginning. It was a confession of sorts, but realistically, if those two could have made me vanish before I had the chance to tell anyone else the whole story, they might have gotten away with everything. Rita's murder, Salazar's death, the helicopter crash, and skipping the country with the Ace Chem settlement money. Leo admitted that they came after me because I just wouldn't let it go. Linda's question, I realized, pertained to the shots I'd fired at David Ratwell in the forest that final night in Santa Fe. I spoke to Gallegos on the phone. That was a real study in frustration. David was still making noises about sticking some kind of civil rights violation on me, not to mention assault charges for what I did to him during the wild ride. I told the police the entire story about that, and they assure me that self-defense allows a woman to do a lot against two armed abductors. That's reassuring. Linda spoke up again. Shirley's called me a couple of times and we've chatted. She's given me a couple of cookbooks on the vegetarian lifestyle, and I'm adopting it. You are? I smiled to take some of the utter surprise out of my voice. Linda's always been a girl who loved her burgers. Yep, I've lost 6 pounds already, she said, spreading her arms to show me her slimmer frame. And my blood pressure's down a few points, too. Well, good for you. Although I couldn't see myself ever giving up Pedro's chicken enchiladas, I genuinely wished her luck. And have you heard anything about Trudy? She's still locked away in the state mental hospital. Not much word from there, but one of the masseuses went up to visit her and said she just babbles about how much David loves her and how they're going to be together. That woman never did have much of a handle on reality, did she? Remembering the wild look in Trudy's eyes, I had to agree. Does Shirley say anything about Calais Light's involvement in David's financial schemes? Oh, no, he wouldn't be. He's way above all that. His seminars are more popular than ever. I've heard there was standing room only at his talk last week. Oh, boy. I stopped eating for a moment and reached across the table to touch her hand. Linda, I don't want to step on your good spiritual intentions, but take my word for this. Calais Light is not all he seems. There's a whole other side to the guy. Something in her face closed. That's all I'm going to say. We learned some good things from his program. Just don't put all your faith in one person. Keep your eyes open. She jabbed a chunk of lettuce and chewed it with vigor. Luckily, Linda isn't one to hold on to anger, and her mood lightened considerably by the time we finished our meal and walked out to our cars. We hugged in the parking lot, and she said, "Take care of yourself, girl. Lunch again on the 18th? Yeah. I squeezed her hand and walked to my own vehicle. At home, I found Drake organizing his desk. He looked as if a giant weight had come off his shoulders as he tucked his research documents into folders and stuck them away in a file box, labeled for delivery to Rick Valdez's office. Even though Mike Walters died in that crash, I'm glad we were able to clear him of any fault. And I feel that the case being dismissed was the right thing. It wasn't the manufacturer's fault either. Leo will do jail time and he'll never get his mechanic's license back. That's about all the victims can expect. Didn't you say that all 3 men had life insurance? Yeah. I know that doesn't replace a husband or a father, but neither does $1 million settlement. I just hope everyone is able to get on with their lives now. And us? Maybe we'll be able to put the worries behind us and get on with life, too. Planning on it. Starting right now. He pulled me onto his lap and gave me a kiss that sent tingles clear to my toes. This concludes Gossip Can Be Murder by Connie Shelton. This novel is a work of fiction.
Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. If you'd like to receive our online newsletter listing new releases, simply go to booksinmotion.com and register with your email address. Newsletter members receive special discounts and freebies. No purchase necessary. That's one word, booksinmotion.com. From Books in Motion, this is Rebecca Cook. Thanks for listening.